Good evening to all the spectators following in streaming this event organized by Left International, the international working group of Die Linke. Today we have organized this talk called Gentrifications Are Non-Germans to Blame, and how can we expropriate the big landlords together. To answer these questions, we have today a great panel with three activists involved in different campaigns in Berlin, in Germany, but also in other countries. My name is Jaime Martinez, and I will moderate this talk. Before we start, you are all invited to participate in the discussion, sending the questions to the streaming, and my colleagues will gather them and we will ask them later to our speakers. First of all, we have Joanna Kusiak, activist in the campaign Deutsche, Wohnen, Enteignen in Berlin, and also sociologist at the King's College in Cambridge. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Hello, thank you.
Second, we have here today Karen Nafersky, a housing activist in Brooklyn, housing organizer with Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA in New York City, as well as editor of Jacobin magazine. Thank you very much also for accepting our invitation. And finally, we have today with us Hülya Kilic, housing activist in Kreuzberg, one of the districts of Berlin, and especially involved in campaigns led by migrants. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation today. Well, let's go directly with the first question, and it's easy, I think. Could you tell us in which campaigns you are involved? Could you give us a context of these campaigns? Let's start directly with Hülya.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for your invitation. And yeah, I'm now just as activist. I'm now as activist in a group. It's in the Oranienstraße, in the Oranian Street in Kreuzberg, in the district Kreuzberg. And I had there a shop. I'm a shop owner, but from Deutsche Wohnen also. And I organized there in the last time, I think maybe 20 or 25 business shop people, migrants. They are so many years there. And I was before by Ora Nostra, and I have now have a new group, a new activist group in Oranienstraße, because we find that we have there not so much place to speak as migrant shop owners, migrant people in district Kreuzberg.
Although Kreuzberg is maybe one of the districts in Berlin with the highest migrant population, I think.
Yeah, one of them. Neukölln also, Wedding also, Moabit also.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Hülya. Then I would like to ask Karen. You come, as I said in the introduction, from Brooklyn, the New York City. Which is the campaign, or which are the campaigns you are involved in?
Sure. So we have a very active branch in New York City of the Democratic Socialists of America. And one of the priority issues that we are working on is expanding tenant protections. So in 2018 and 2019, we had a big campaign to increase rent control protections around the state. And we won a big expansion in the protections that tenants have in New York State. And then since the COVID pandemic began, our campaign has been pushing the government to cancel rent and to provide, to get rid of rent debt for tenants in New York. You know, we have many people, especially because of the pandemic, who are struggling, who can't pay rent and who need that assistance. And so as we look from that campaign towards the future, we're thinking about how to create opportunities for construction of more social housing, opportunities for tenants to purchase their apartments, and also protections against eviction.
I was talking the other day with a friend living in New York, and he told me that Brooklyn is one of the districts or areas that is suffering now at this point, or the last years, the gentrification at most. Is that so?
Certainly, it's a big. I mean, Brooklyn has experienced like huge rise in rents and in home prices. Also, a lot of people like buying homes, but it's also home to a lot of neighborhoods that have not really experienced gentrification in the same way, and that are actually struggling with bad conditions and predatory landlords and sort of the other side of the housing problem. And one other thing that I will say that we try to, it's a big piece of our campaigns in New York, is trying to address the problem of homelessness. We have, before the pandemic, we had 92,000 homeless people in New York State. And these are, these numbers are only growing as people deal with the economic problems that the pandemic has caused.
Thank you very much, Karen, for this context introduction. And last, I will give the floor to Joanna. I already presented you as a member of Deutsche Wohnen und Enteignen, but maybe you are in other campaigns also. So, Joanna, I give you the floor.
Hi, thanks for invitation. Definitely Deutsche Wohnen und Enteignen is also, I would say, the most important housing campaign in Berlin right now. Literally, it means expropriate Deutsche Wohnen, and Deutsche Wohnen is the largest housing corporation. So it's a stock-listed corporation that owns over 100,000 apartment units in Berlin. And the aim of the campaign is to expropriate these corporate landlords, so effectively deprivatize housing, because the housing that those corporations own often is a formerly municipal housing, and to bring housing back to a new form of social or municipal ownership. And I think what's important about our campaign is that it really emerged out of a long history of Berlin housing struggles. I mean, the tenant movement in Berlin dates back to 19th century and has a long and rich history, and a lot of things has been tried. And for many years, the campaign was about pushing against increasing rents through different forms of tenant laws. And what is different about this campaign, or what is more radical, is that it does try to tackle problem at its roots. So it's not, again, about making the raises of rent smaller or making the rents rise not as quickly, but it is really about changing the structure of ownership to ensure secure access and secure and equal access to housing in the long term. So this is a very radical, in many ways, it's a very radical initiative, but it also stands out because it's at the same time, it's fully legal. To achieve this expropriation or socialization of housing, the initiative leverages a clause of German federal constitution that indeed allows for socialization of land. It has never historically been done, but it's legally possible. So in short, we want to tackle housing crisis at its roots. We want to deprivatize housing, take housing away from corporations, and do it all by means of law.
Thank you. Usually when it's said it's radical, it's kind of negative, but radical is just etymologically is going to the root of the problem. So these campaigns go to the root of the problems. Now I'm also active in Deutsche Wohnen und Enteignen. We are now collecting the signatures. Could you maybe now, could you tell us how it's currently going with the campaign? Mm-hmm. At what point is it now?
Yes. So the campaign, while the mechanism that campaign wants to use is legal, the political engine of the campaign is a public referendum. So in some sense, in the English-speaking universum, you could try to imagine it as a nationalization, but from the grassroots up. So not something that comes from the state that expropriates, but really the people who, by means of a public referendum, de facto politically force the land of Berlin to expropriate those corporations. And procedurally, this means that starting last week, within the next 4 months, we have to collect 170,000 valid signatures in Berlin. That means to make sure that there's enough valid signatures, we need to collect roughly 200,000 signatures. So there's a huge mobilization. Naturally, collecting signatures is more challenging than usual in the times of pandemic, because there's less mass events, which often makes it easier to collect a lot of signatures. At the same time, there's incredible energy. So I think it's just the beginning of this 4-month process. So it's very important to keep this energy in the long term. And in this sense, everyone who's listening and who's in Berlin, I really encourage to join us collecting signatures, either in a structured way or just by printing out the signature list from our webpage and just asking friends, neighbors, people who are, and here maybe there's one caveat. Legally speaking, the signatures that do count are signatures of people who have German citizenship and are registered in Berlin. So, of course, this week we couldn't do anything about. That's just how law operates. But that means that a lot of people who live in Berlin and who are affected by housing crisis cannot sign or cannot give the valid signature. However, they still can help collect those signatures. And of course, if the initiative is successful, if the housing is taken away from corporation and made municipal again, one of the big points in our campaign is also to equalize access to housing, including preventing the discrimination on the base of nationality, race, gender, ability or disability, and so on. So everyone is on board, and even people who are not eligible to sign are often members of the initiative, and they help collecting signatures.
This was exactly my second question to you, and I was going to ask you now, how are migrants organized in the campaign? Because, as you said, 20% of the population, more or less, in Berlin are not allowed to vote because they don't have, or we don't have, the German nationality. Could you tell us more in detail how are migrants organized inside the campaign, maybe farther than collecting the signatures, or if there are any special groups inside the campaign to deal with this point, with the participation of migrants in the campaign?
The campaign is growing also all the time. In this sense, we're still, the membership is exploding, so to say, and new initiative and new strands of the campaign are growing very organically. So in terms of activities by non-German within the campaign, there is, again, first, the collection of signatures at the moment politically the most important. So that's also a big area where people are engaged. But there's also, precisely for English speaker, there's a working group Right to the City, which also helps to network Berlin activists with the whole world, ensure international publicity, exchange knowledge. We have a lot of knowledge exchange also of housing movements, for example, in New York, because even if the context is different, a lot of political know-how is still the same, which includes how to organize successful events, a successful campaign, how to collect signatures in a more efficient way, how to address certain group of peoples, and so on and so on. So there's also a lot of networks and exchange of knowledge between housing movements and housing activists worldwide. And last but not least, if you look at the webpage of Deutsche, Wohnen und Enteignen, you will notice that we are divided in different work groups, and then there is always very practical help that can be offered within those groups. So there's a signature collection group, there is an action group that is responsible, for example, for hanging posters around the city or hanging stickers, organizing little events or little performances, so all kinds of action, so to say. And here it really does not matter the national. I mean, basically, in all of the working groups within the campaign, nationality does not matter. I mean, what matters is the engagement. So then there is a working group, strategic one that works on legal strategy and the general political strategy of the campaign. There are working groups that deal very specifically with helping tenants in certain houses or areas to organize, so giving the tenants the know-how of how to organize effectively. There are people, of course, who translate our message into different languages to reach different groups in Berlin. So, and there are people, again, of different nationalities who are helping with setting the web page up or designing a graphic or shooting a little promotional video. And there's all this practical task where really it does not matter if you're German or not. What it matters is if you care for Berlin, if you care for housing justice.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you for the context and how the migrants are working also in the campaign. I wanted to ask now, Hülya, we said at the beginning that you have worked in campaigns not only where the migrants have participated, but also led by migrants. So the question is, how should we do, or what should we make these campaigns against gentrifications or the struggle for public housing or for control of rents or any housing struggle? How could we make these campaigns attractive, in this case of Germany, to non-Germans? And
now,
how is your experience?
Yeah, we have now for, yes, I understand. For me, it's really too difficult to tell these all my minds or things about thoughts about this theme, because it's so complex, and now it's really, we have so not so much time in this context of this gentrification in Berlin and in the context with the migrants, because Germany or Berlin or the German laws had a big tradition of, so you have to think about the people can so many years vote here because they have not the German nationality. So this is a big problem. We had, these companies, Deutsche Wohnen, Enteignen, you said this in English, expropriated the housing companies. The most of the people, the worker class, are of course for this possibility. It's totally normal. But how you can move people if they have never before Möglichkeit, a possibility to part of this society. Yeah, if you never have this tradition or this thinking to this kind of mind to say I'm political and organized in these political movements, in civil rights movements. This is a big movement of many of years. But if you are always a worker or a homeless, or you are a woman and you are a migrant and you have never this possibility to learn to be active in this part of this political part. So now we are so happy that so many young people between 20 and 30 and so they speak English, they come from the European Union, other countries to Berlin, and they are here active and they are left. So this is very welcome and we like it, and I like this so much, and this is for us very good. But this problem with the migrants is a really big problem. I mean the migrants, Turkish, Kurdish, Arabic, and from ex-Yugoslavia part, these people who are 20 years, 30 years here, 40 years, 50 years, and we are the second and third and fourth generation now in Germany. We have been here since 50 years. I born and grew up. I'm similar 50 years old. and yeah, it's a big problem. So these campaigns are very good, but it's enough to move so many people who are workers and who we have so different problems now to come around. Now we have COVID, we have, I don't know, we have kids, we have families, we have our cultural, social, different part of, we are part of this society, of course, we are this society. But if you can't vote, I speak for different people. They have Turkish pass, they have Arabic pass, they have these nationalities. So you can be a part of this society. It's not the same like in America or in other countries. In Germany is different, yeah, and in France is also different. So we have had a problem, and we had before in Berlin, we had so many social housing companies, because Berlin is the typical in the past. It was after the Cold War, after the Berlin Wall, during the Berlin Wall, Berlin is a typical worker city. Yeah, it was a typical, or it is, or it was much more typical worker city. So we had so many flats to rent for worker family, migrant families. So we have now all these neoliberal pushes, pressures from all these kind of economic people who made all these in stuff of money, in stuff of these neoliberal structures. We saw that in Istanbul, we saw this in so different cities, and also the capitals in Europe. And yeah, in New York, we know that. And it's a big problem for us now in Berlin. And yes, it's important to bring this back, to catch this back for the most of the people here.
And how important is also the role of the language here? That this first approach is made maybe in the own language. For instance, I think in Spanish. In my case, the first approach I got was in Spanish actually to the campaign. For instance, how important is to receive flyers, information in Turkish, Arabic, Italian, Polish. So their own language. What's the role of the language?
There is nothing wrong. I think the wrong is the countries who had so many possibility and monies and the government and all the political politicians are they have these what did you say, Verantwortung? What is the word? Verantwortung? Responsibility. This is the part of this responsibility from this kind of governments. For example, now Germany and yeah, we had here agreement, you know, in Germany between some countries in the 60s, and this agreement said we bring people here as physical workers, you know, and if you are a worker, then you have you are not you can't speak here, you don't have this education here. So you had yeah, this is a part. The language is also a big problem, but I think it's also not a problem, because if the people don't have these possibilities, so then it's a problem.
Thank you very much, Hülya. Now I wanted to change the focus and go to the first question of the title of our event. Was called Gentrifications Are Non-Germans to Blame, or in this case any migrants. And I wanted to ask Karen that sometimes from the politics or the media is said kind of arguments like migrants, foreigners are coming to this neighborhood or to this city, and that's the reason rents are rising, or even there are no more houses for the locals. But do you really think that migrants should be blamed for gentrification?
Thank you. It's a really important question, and definitely it's something that we are thinking about a lot in New York as well. So a lot of what Hülya just talked about is true here as well, although it's a little bit different in that we have both International migrants in New York, we have a lot of people from Central America, from South Asia, Bangladesh, Nepal. We have people coming from China, from Korea. And so for them, sometimes, especially if they're newer immigrants, the problem of nationality and of being able to vote is the same. We have, we try to do our meetings, not so much, it's harder within DSA, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but with our coalitions, we try to do meetings in multiple languages, publish materials in multiple languages. But for many of the other, what we usually in the US would call gentrifiers, people like myself. I live in New York City, but I didn't grow up here. I moved here. A lot of members in DSA and people who are active in our organizing work are young, have a college degree, have maybe a decent job and disposable income. And so the question is, those are people who, actually in New York, we can't do the type of referendum that you all are doing in Berlin. You can't have like a citizen referendum. You only can have changes in the law that are introduced by lawmakers. So it's been a really important piece of our strategy actually to get more socialists elected to the legislature and work closely with them to introduce the kind of proposals that we want to see. And that's actually a big piece of our strategy right now. We have 6 elected socialists in the New York State legislature who came out of DSA and were supported by our campaigns. And now we're working closely with them to introduce legislation around eviction protections and giving people the right to purchase their apartments if they go up for sale. But there is definitely this, this question around like, what is the role of especially young people, maybe who have a college education and have a little bit more money, are those the people who are responsible for gentrification? And I think I want to say there's sort of 2 reasons why this is such a powerful message and why it comes up so much, at least in our case. So one is that there are a lot of people politically who are opposed to the kinds of reforms that we are promoting. There are elected officials who don't believe in social housing, who don't believe in rent control, who, for years have been supported by campaign donations from landlords and from the real estate industry. But of course, it's really popular. The agenda that we have is broadly popular. We have polls showing that even in parts of the state where many people own homes, there's overwhelming majority support for eviction protections. So what these elected officials will do is they'll say, they're not going to come out and say, oh, we don't want to support tenants, we don't want to support rent control. They're going to say, those people are not really from New York, and this only affluent, young white people care about canceling rent or taxing the wealthy or whatever it may be. So in part, it's a political messaging strategy that our opponents use, but also I think, people feel really guilty internally. And I think it is very jarring to move into a neighborhood to see the challenges that people face and that your neighbors face, and then there's all this kind of discourse about people who move into neighborhoods and they're rude to the people that live there. So I understand where that comes from, but I think it's so important to recognize that really the people who are responsible for gentrification, who are actually driving up prices, warehousing apartments, pushing people out, it's not tenants. Even if you have tenants who are more affluent and maybe even if they behave badly on a personal level, it's really the gentrifiers are the real estate companies who are speculating, buying up and warehousing property, and also the politicians who do their bidding, right? So I think that is really an important piece of how we frame these campaigns. And so one of the things that we have done a lot in DSA is a lot of political education, because I think once you see how powerful real estate companies are in New York, and how much money elected officials are taking from landlords, it's very hard to say, yeah, it's tenants who are the problem. It's like migrants or people who didn't grow up here. So we do a lot of research and try to like publish it in a really compelling and interesting way for people so that they realize like, this is what's going on in the government. There's like so much power being exerted to make sure that landlords can do whatever they want. And so I think that's really been a very key piece of our strategy over the last few years, and especially throughout our housing campaigns, to really turn the spotlight onto landlords, who, by the way, like part of the reason that we have this this idea that it's tenants who are responsible for gentrification is that the landlords are used to kind of hiding. You know, they're used to having like multiple different companies, and it's like a little bit difficult to figure out who owns which building and where they're donating their money. And so one of the things that we think is very important is to really do some research, shine a spotlight on that, make it harder for them to say, oh, we're not here, and also make it harder for politicians to be associated with them. And so we have really, all of our elected officials refuse to take corporate donations from landlords and from real estate companies. And so I think that's been, it's been very important for us to try to emphasize that really the people who are responsible for gentrification are the real estate companies, are the landlords, and are the politicians who receive contributions from them.
Yes, usual, or sometimes happens that, the focus is put in the migrants, but migrants from other countries because it has a xenophobic component. Of course, if you come from, I don't know, from Frankfurt to Berlin, it's okay. But if you come from Poland, Italy, Turkey to Neukölln or to Berlin, is not such okay. So of course, it's always this component in all of this, and it's also an interest of these capitalists, these real estate companies, to put focus in the external enemy. So thank you very much, because I think you have given a very complete picture. Before I continue with the next round of questions, if you want to ask a question to our speakers in the webpage, theLeftBerlin.com, there is a button on the down on the right, below right on the right, where you can see ask a question. So send us the questions if you are interested to ask something to the speakers. I will continue with you, Karen. We have said before that now in the campaign Deutsche Wohnen und Enteignen, we are collecting the signature a referendum to socialize the housing owned by the big real estate companies takes place in September. Let's imagine, and I hope it happens, let's imagine the referendum happens, we win the referendum, and the real estate companies are expropriate and we socialize the houses. What would be the impact of such a victory to campaigns in other countries, or in general to housing politics in other countries, or specifically in the USA? What do you think would be?
Yeah, so I think it would be really huge, actually. Partly because, it's impossible not to talk about the pandemic and the impact that it has had globally. And I think there's been, for those of us who were organizing before COVID, we've seen the really staggering inequalities that exist around the world. But I think it's become even more clear over the pandemic that there are some companies and landlords among them that really have profited actually from this pandemic, while millions of people have been thrown out of their jobs and their apartments and are really struggling to survive. So I think this is a moment where it's really, we are looking for a lot of inspiration and looking for examples that people can fight back and that people can win against these larger companies. One other thing that I will say too, especially like just in the context of the US, so the left has very little power at the national level to push for initiatives like, social housing or rent cancellation. I think we're in a much better place than we were even a few years ago. We have more left-wing elected officials in Congress. I think, President Biden certainly is not on the left, but he's feeling the pressure. And there's an opportunity for us to continue to build, but we don't, the left just doesn't have a lot of power at the national level in the US. So we are doing these state by state initiatives, and it's people do something in New York and then they look to see what's happening in California. People are always looking for examples from other places. And actually, New York is very far ahead of most other states in the US. So often other states look to New York to say, okay, they have rent control, they have this long history of tenant organizing. And I think there's a sense, especially from politicians who don't want to continue along the path that we're on of really expanding tenant rights and building tenant power. People will say, okay, New York is really out there. We have rent control. We have all these other policies. And I think it would be really kind of important and inspirational for us to be able to say, actually, look, this is what's happening in Berlin. This is something that would be extremely, impactful if we were able to similarly expropriate some of the huge landlords that we have in New York. Obviously, the context is different in terms of what's legally possible, but we are, as I mentioned, as we move out of the first year of the pandemic and probably out of, there's money coming now from the federal government for rent relief, as we start to turn our focus toward the long term and what kind of organizing we can do over the long term. We want to think about creating new social housing, both by building new homes, but also by moving existing homes into community ownership, allowing nonprofits or community land trusts to buy existing housing. And, we have some really horrible corporate landlords here in New York. We have Blackstone, we have Kushner companies, and many others. And so I think it would be really valuable to say there is actually in this moment a group of people who are organizing to really create the kind of social housing that would be so valuable here. So I think certainly it would be very inspirational, and also would be good to have the connections between left groups in Germany and other parts of Europe, and also New York and other parts of the US.
I don't know how it's in the States, but for instance, in Spain, when they are looking for examples, they always say, and see how they do it in Germany. And Germany is the usual example inside Europe. So I think also it would be a very, very important message if this campaign reaches the goals we are looking for. I wanted to ask you now, Joanna, the campaign, Deutsche Wohnen und Enteignen, has already built many networks at different levels with other housing campaigns inside Berlin. I think, for instance, Stop Heimstaden, for instance. But also in other cities of Germany, there is an attempt to networking with other cities, but also in solidarity with other struggles happening in the city with other topics, not only housing. How should the networking continue once the campaign is finished, when the referendum is achieved, and also the objectives that we hope we will achieve?
Let me first strengthen what was just said, namely that I'm convinced that if we win this struggle, if we manage to expropriate 250,000 apartments in Berlin, we're talking billions and billions of euros of corporate money, and the shareholders of Deutsche Wohnen and other companies are all the usual suspects that we know globally, including BlackRock, Norwegian retirement funds, name it. It's the financialization of housing. It's a global process that, in some sense, it has maybe different versions, but the general rule applies everywhere. And I think if we manage to do it in Berlin, to get it done, and I believe we will, it is really globally a game changer, because that would be independently of the legal details and how exactly can it work, which are always very particular. The message that it sends is global. I mean, first it sends the message that it is possible to break the rule of capital or the rule of specifically finance over housing. And also that it is possible to organize at the grassroots level and fight with the largest and the strongest enemies, the biggest finance companies, the corporations. So I think that's of crucial importance, and both in terms of the courage to finding solution in unobvious places, like in the German Constitution, which is not the, let's say, first place where radical left searches for solution often, but also to show that it is politically possible. It would really, really change the landscape globally. And of course, it will also affect those companies and therefore affect global housing markets. So I think that's extremely interesting. And what we should do, of course, during the campaign and after the campaign is to continue this exchange, continue the network and the struggle, because we do actually have common enemy. If we look who's behind financialization of housing, again, companies are BlackRock, sorry. They are creating troubles for tenants everywhere, in New York, in Berlin, in Stockholm, in Spain. I mean, they are everywhere. So in some sense, there's a possibility, again, for international left or international organization, because, again, we actually do have a common enemy. And because of how financial capitalism operates, a lot can be influenced even already on the level of PR. We have seen it in Berlin, for example, in 2019, where partly as a side effect of our campaign, the government introduced rental freeze. So the rents were frozen for 5 years. And the same day that it was announced, the shares of Deutsche Wohnen, this biggest corporation, started very clearly dropping. So in theory, nothing yet has happened. But in practice, of course, it did, because this is a speculative market, and therefore speculative change also affects it often in a real way. And in this sense, I think we should also be more open to trying to affect it trying to affect financial markets with their own tools. So combine the classical repertoire of the left, the process, the grassroots organization, the fighting for changing legislation, with also, maybe some kind of Trojan horse approach, where sometimes we enter the logic of the finance and also try to subvert it on this level. And I think especially, I know that's a theme of my academic work as well. That's why I'm probably so keen to talk about it, because that's what I'm exploring in my work too. To which extent you can try to subvert capitalism or financial capitalism with its own tools, including legal tools or PR and so on. But I think that's also the area where it's relatively easy to cooperate and where cooperation really makes sense.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I'm going to ask the same question to Hülya in the last place in this round before we continue with the questions sent by the audience. How should we continue this networking between the different campaigns, struggles, also this networking of migrants with different migrant groups or organizations? How do you think we should continue this work in the future? I give you now the floor.
Yeah, thank you. The problem, it's not a problem. So all of these team from Deutsche Wohnen and Enteignen, or all the civil rights or the rights for the tenants is so important. But in this movement, in all these campaigns, for me, it's important to say we have so many educated, well-educated, very educated from the universities, from all the kind of special class of groups. They are now everywhere, and the other people, they are left or not well educated. Maybe they are workers, they work hard, and they have never this possibility, the opportunity, the opinion, the possibility to be a part of this movement. Yeah, and we discover in Berlin since 20 years, 30 years, all the new kids, as all the kids or from the school, they go directly to university. Directly. After the school, they go to university, and they don't know the life. They don't know to be maybe worker or work with the hands. And then so we have a big group of people, young people. They are now so well educated, and they are organized in their own groups. So there's no mix between the part of the another main part or very important part of the workers, if it's migrant or not migrant. So this is, for me, it's my opinion, it's my mind, it's the problem. So for these companies, it is so important to say the other part of groups, you are a part of them, and you have to know your rights about if you are if you are a meter and you have know your rights. So, and this is very important. For me, it's always the same groups in Berlin who are very good organized, and the tenants are the most of the tenants are not so good organized here.
Thank you very much also for this perspective. Yeah, because maybe most of these people we are talking about, they are not watching this streaming, because as you say, they are working hard, or maybe
for me it's not new. Sorry, I'm so sorry. For me it's not new, because I'm always in the same groups. Yeah, every time, but just here. But I'm in the life, I'm in different groups, you know, from the life and from life on the street. You know, this is so important to say. I want to speak with everybody, and not always in the same groups.
Of course, yeah. If you have a very long 8 hours working, and then a family, kids, and you have to take care of the kids, or you don't have time to follow these streamings. And yeah, we always are more or less kind of the same people, and we try to approach other groups. So that, yeah, I understand this point, and I think it's very important to take this into account in any struggle. Now I'm going to look at the questions the public sent to us. The first one is by Ian to Karen. In New York, I must read it. In New York, is the market dominated by some large corporate landlords who own many thousands of apartments? It's a question. In Berlin, it was calculated by the largest tenants association here that the average tenant in a Deutsche Wohnen apartment pays 2,100 euros per year just for shareholder dividends. Has this been calculated for New York?
Oh, I love that question. I don't know the answer. It may have been calculated, actually, and so I'll encourage anyone who's watching on the stream, if you know the answer to this, to share. I'm not sure that we have one landlord who's quite dominant in the same way. I know Joanna talked a little bit about BlackRock. They're, of course, a major landlord and a big target. But we also have in different parts of the city landlords that are really dominant. So in Queens, Zara Realty is a landlord that a lot of people have experienced problems with. We also have like the city keeps track of who are the worst landlords in the city in terms of the amount of housing code violations that they have in their building and complaints from tenants. So I'm not sure actually if people have calculated how much of the of rent goes to shareholder dividends, but it's a really great question. And I think it kind of speaks to, you know, the basic I think reason that all of us are part of this fight is how just irrational it is in this moment to know that people are paying money for a basic necessity, but that then it's going to like line the pockets of shareholders instead of being part of a basic system of social provision.
Sorry, I couldn't switch on the microphone. Thank you very much. There is another question in this case to Hülya. I don't know if it's maybe because as a result of kind of discouraged when we were talking how to get to the working class. And the question is directly, do you think that there is any chance to bring the working classes and the other activists together? Or what could we do to reach the working people? I think your microphone is switched off, could be?
Yeah, okay, so to organize meetings through my neighborhood, it's also exist active working campaigns with my neighborhood, for example. How can I tell something it happens in my neighborhood? How can I tell this in my neighborhood, this information? How can I connect these kind of informations with my neighborhood? And this is very important, because if we are meet and we make these kind of social meetings virtual, and then we have the possibility to give us these informations and make discussions about this. But for me, it's very important as activist to active my neighborhood. So, and now by Deutsche Wohnen and Enteignen is this kind of this is an example. But for me, it's not enough. Okay, it's very important to say now we want this, but for me as Berliner, I know it's not enough, because a big group of main group part of this movement is not active, and I think it's a task. It's a main work for everybody. Everybody can say, how can I get contact with my neighbor, my next one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And I have another related questions, but related question. In this case, I'm going to ask Joanna. Let's think any person has a family and it's not a full-time activist or doesn't have many time for activism. How can they support the campaign, for instance, the campaign Deutsche Wohnen und Enteignen, if they don't have much time for activism?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a lot of people are in this situation. So, and I think we have a core group of people who really do a lot. But actually, most of our activists are not full-time activists. They have jobs and families and other engagements. So it's still possible to do something. I think at the current moment, indeed, collecting the signatures is more important and most important. And even if someone doesn't have time to spend hours on the street just talking to random people and convincing them to sign, everyone can print out 2 or 3 lists and at least, ask friends or go around in their own house, which shouldn't take more than, half an hour probably. Just talk to neighbors and make them sign and then send it per post to Deutsche Wohnen und Enteignen. The lists can be printed from the website. It's maybe actually, I don't know if I can post something here in the chat, but maybe I'll ask Jaime I'll send link to Jaime and that can be also posted underneath the whole discussion. But I think, yes, within the next 4 months, that's definitely the best one can do, is every single signature counts and everyone can collect, even a couples, even if you can only get 2 or 3 valid signatures, please don't make it stop you. Have them sent to us. That does make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Again, on the topic of the class issue, there is a question also: what's the role and the position of the unions on these housing politics struggles? Anyone wants to take the floor, because it's different, I suppose, in USA, in Germany, or specifically, if any concrete campaign. Does any one of you want to take the floor directly? The mics are open.
Well, I can just say one thing, that the unions are already supporting us, and of course it's very, very important. So in Berlin, several of the union, including Verdi, one of the biggest one, but also IG Metall, they decided to support the campaign at the moment. It means they are using the networks to collect signatures for us. And of course, there is a direct exchange. So yes, absolutely, unions are with us, and if more unions want to be with us, we're happy. And it's not just unions; it's all kinds of organizations, big and small. I mean, we also partner with Berliner Mieterverein, but also we having discussion with environmental organizations too, because a lot of issues are similar, and also the tool of using public referendum and the legal idea of socialization could be and should be probably also used by environmental movements to protect certain crucial areas of land that are important from environmental point of view. So we trying to build a lot of alliances, including the ones that are not immediately obvious, like with the environmentalist movements. And we really encourage every organization, big and small, to join us in the efforts, because in the long term, this is a game changer. And if this referendum is going to work, this is a game changer, not just for housing movements, it's a game changer for the left in general.
Thank you. I wanted to ask maybe, Karen, what's the position of the unions in the housing struggles there in the USA?
So yeah, I think it's a little bit complicated, as it is with a lot of different labor questions in the US. We definitely have some unions that really are strongly supporting our campaigns in New York. And often when that's the case, it's because their members also can't find housing, are struggling, especially when you think about, childcare workers, healthcare, home health aides. We have a lot of who in New York have a very strong and powerful union. And it's been a major issue for their members that they are struggling to stay in their housing and are dealing with landlord abuses. There definitely, I think, it is more work that we can do, and more sort of work to be done more generally to shift the groundwork and build a stronger relationship between the housing movement and some other unions who I think we would like to see as allies, but who have political reasons, maybe for not being as closely tied to the housing movement. But one thing that's really interesting is that we have, this challenge where a lot of public sector workers, teachers, others who work for the government, their pensions are invested often in the same multinational companies that are then evicting and abusing their members. So you have teachers in New York City or in California whose public pensions are actually invested in companies like Blackstone. And that is a massive contradiction, and really, I think, an important reason to try to educate folks and to try to build solidarity between those workers and tenants.
Thank you, Karen. I wanted to ask you, Hülya, what is and what should be the role of the unions in this aspect, or in these struggles? How do you think they should help to politicize, or to make this networking, or what should be the role, and what is the role of the unions?
Well, I'm also leader of labor union in a company. In the company are similar 150 persons, and in my experience, it's also very hard to move the rights for the workers, because the reality catch you and put you back, because it's very good. It's a big sign if Verdi or all the unions are with this campaign. It's also good. It's very good. But the reality is, I ask me also all the time. I read about this, but Enteignen, Deutsche Wohnen, Enteignen, this housing company to expropriate it. It's meaning for the time. It's for a special time, and it's this was my question for Joanna, because by Deutsche Wohnen Enteignen, the question was the support. Yeah, it's important that the union supported this, and other civil movement groups also in Berlin and everywhere. But what meaning this for us for the future, and how from which money they control all these big companies and these big flats. It's true that the Blackstones and Deutsche Wohnen had so many in this group, are so many different part of big capitalist groups. They make this pressure of the people here in Berlin and everywhere in the world, who make the rents higher, and the laws are for the people are done so bad as solution. But sorry, I forget your question.
No, it was the role of the unions. But before we continue with the discussion, Karen told us at the very beginning that she should go after 1 hour, because now in the USA is working time. So if I'm going to to give the floor to Karen for a last for a closing statement, and we continue with the questions of the spectators. If you don't mind, Hülya, sorry to interrupt at this point. Karen, do you want to say something, a closing statement before you go?
Sure. And again, I'm very sorry that I have to leave. As Jaime said, it's middle of the workday for me, and I unfortunately need to go back to work. But I really have appreciated hearing, especially from Hülya and Joanna, about the really great work that is happening in Berlin. And I think certainly for DSA, we would be interested in continuing to keep this relationship open, to hear how the campaign is going, and provide any support that we can. And we're certainly going to also be interested in learning from all of you as we move forward with our campaigns around social housing and eviction protections. And I think it's really valuable to have this type of solidarity. As I said earlier, it's important that we keep our focus on on the landlords and on the politicians that they are working with, but it's really hard to do that. It's a lot of education, a lot of research, just like a lot of very and also a lot of the sort of external organizing work that you all are doing, talking to your neighbors, gathering signatures, having mass events, knocking on doors when it's safe to do that. So once again, thank you guys so much for having me. I'm really excited to see what is happening with this campaign moving forward, and to continue the connection.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. So we really appreciate that you are here today, and thank you for your time at this time in the USA. So thank you for coming in the name of Left Internationals. Thank you very much, and have a nice week. And we will see us in the struggle somehow online, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I continue with the question to Hülya. If you want to continue on the topic, the unions and the role of the unions. If you wanted to add something, sorry to interrupt you, because Karen, but Karen should go. So if you want to say something about the previous question, Hülya?
For me, it's no problem. It's okay.
Okay, there is, before I go to a question for Joanna, there is a commentary, not a question. I'm going to read it. This is not a question, just a comment. I find tragic this idea that workers don't have time to struggle or don't understand the struggle. It sounds like it's not possible to politicize them, and it is also patronizing. In Northeast Brazil, one of the poorest regions in Latin America, where I come from, it is historically leftist and combative, even though the absolute majority of its population is of non-white workers. How the left functions in Europe in general, and Germany in particular, is just a reflection of how capitalism works here. It is not about workers being unable or incapable to join. Sorry, just wanted to stress that. Maybe you want to say something on this comment? Although it's not a question, but it's a comment, maybe a reflection, and maybe you want to say something, Hülya. And then I have another question to Joanna, more related to the campaign, Deutsche Wohnen und Enteignen. Do you want to say something, Hülya, on this reflection, or?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. So yeah, this reflection about the question from how work capitalism in Berlin, how it's of course it's different as in other part of area here, and here are different laws and different situations. You can compare this with different countries and different places here, but you can be sure that this kind of aggressive or this kind of capitalism is now everywhere. Is everywhere in the world. The world is so. It's now. We live now in a time. It's so fast. It's faster as before. Some professions are not anymore, and some kind of to these. Housing companies are not this same how we had this before in Berlin 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Everything is now changing, and I think it's very important for the movement. Left movement is worldwide is to keep together and to learn from each other, and to connect it word in the world. I think it's very important.
Thank you. This is again a related question with how the working class may take part in the campaigns. This is to Joanna. First, thanks to all the speakers. I completely agree with Hülya. Is there some mobilization that Deutsche Wohnen und Enteignen is doing to reach out to the working class in Berlin?
Well, maybe two things I'm going to say on that. First, of course, yes, and I think important branch of our campaign is we have this working group called AG Starthilfe, so the beginner's help, so to say, that really directly reaches to houses, so people living in houses that are directly affected. So when something happens, there's trouble with a landlord in certain house or certain apartment blocks, we offer activists helps, including how to organize, just basically sharing the political know-how, how you organize the first tenant meeting, how you, how you do certain steps, both legally and in terms of political organization, from getting to know each other and turning yourself into some sort of political collective to fighting back. And because this is on the house by house basis, this is everyone. And I think it's also really important not to create upfront these divisions between, working people. I mean, there are working people in the sense almost all people in Berlin are working people. They just have different jobs and different type of works, which is not to say that I deny structural differences and that some people work more or harder, but more to say we are all in the same boat. In Berlin, 85% of people are tenants. That means that it's not just working class that lives in rental housing. There are also academic professors and even business people. And that actually we do see as an advantage, because if you have a broad range of people affected, then it's much easier to create real in-depth solidarity between different social classes and different kinds of people affected. And therefore, it is more possible to build a really, really broad campaign. And that is needed for the referendum. If we need 200,000 signatures, if we need people to go and vote in this referendum, this means that we need to convince people of all social classes and, in some sense, all political orientation. We do not appeal only to people who define themselves as leftists. We have to reach also SPD voters, CDU voters, people who we might disagree on some other issues, but who are just like us. They are affected by the housing situation, and just like us, they are determined to change it. So I think it's good to try to reach out different groups of the population. Second thing that I think is particularly interesting about Berlin housing struggle and also its history, and Deutsche Wohnen and Enteignen, I think that this initiative is in some sense both anti-systemic, because it does want to expropriate a capitalist player, but also pro-systemic. And of course, what comes across in the media is mostly the expropriation part. But what we really want to do in the long term is we want to create an entirely new, publicly run, but democratically participative institution that would govern this housing. Because that's actually the key second step. And we all know on the left that the negative part of the struggle and campaign is often maybe more exciting, but in some sense easier than the part where we got rid of the evil people and now we have to actually create something that sustains itself and that helps us to prevent the same mistakes to appear ever again. So the aim of Deutsche Wohnen and Enteignen is indeed to create this new institution that would govern this housing in a way that is participatory, that allows for lack of discrimination against tenants, that allows for really managing this housing in a way that makes sure that, for example, old people who need accessible housing with elevators, or that they get access to it, and that ensures also housing mobility. If a family with 2 kids splits, there's a divorce, all of a sudden they might need 2 smaller apartments instead of 1 big. And these things are currently, or in the recent years, have been very hard to manage, even this type of housing mobility. So we want to make it all possible. And to close with coming back to this comment about working class, to which extent people have time or have will to participate. I think what we are very aware in Berlin is that political participation is incredibly important. We want to encourage everyone. We don't want anyone also to feel forced. We also feel, and that's why we want to create this institution. It's not about that every single of us should have now 3 jobs, the jobs to earn money, the job as an activist, the job, the idea is that we have to put a lot of work now so that we can set up an institution that allow a working mother to spend time with their kids after she's home and not spend time fighting with her landlord. Because, this mobilization is precisely a point to create a change in which we don't need to be activists at all times, all the time. And I think that's what many people in Berlin are tired too. We have many different agendas in life and we have to keep fighting our landlords. And that's why this radical initiative is supposed to stop that.
Thank you very much. And the last question I have here is very nice because it was sent by a person of 2 months old. It's like a question on the future. Mm-hmm. What do you think the housing market in Berlin will be like in 20 years' time when I am old enough to move out from my parents' house? This is a question from Avery in Kreuzberg. I must say, when I read it, 20 years time, for me, it's like very optimist, because, for instance, in Spain, the youth cannot move out in average until 30 years old, or close to 30 years old. But anyway, how do you think will be the housing market in Berlin in 20 years time? I don't know if Hülya or Joanna, who wants to start?
Well, I mean, I can speculate. Why not? I think, and I believe, I want to believe that by then we will have created this wonderful institution that I was just talking about. And that means that the housing market will be more equalized and more accessible to avoid the problems that we have now. That also means, just to add to this wonderful vision of a socialized housing, that means not just housing, that means also the public sphere. I mean, in Berlin, as in many other places, including New York, we have these problems that more, and COVID only makes it worse, that, let's say, local cafes or locally owned shop increasingly have to move out to make room for another chain supermarket, chain cafe, so that everything is copy-paste. If the housing is socialized, that means that also on the ground floor, there's room for more diversity, for more unique urban space. And this is all important also in the context of a research, I think, done in 2018, that shows, that was before the rental freeze, importantly, that shows if the current rent dynamic would continue, then most of people who are now mid-30s in Berlin would not afford to retire in the city, which means, which is, of course, would be tragic news. I mean, because precisely when people are old, they don't want to move, and they don't want to move away from the cities where they got access to healthcare and so on. So I would say to this young person, make sure your parents sign and we'll be, wir bleiben alle. We are gonna stay, as Berlin's saying goes.
I think if he's politicized with 2 years old, we can also count the signature as political signature from Avery.
Exactly.
I wanted to ask you, Hülya, how do you imagine the housing market in 20 years, in 20 years' time?
Okay. For me, it's so difficult to say something about this, and I hope that we have in 20 years so good laws, so good structures here, that we have our big housing companies again. We had before here over 20. We had this in Berlin, and it was not belong to these big companies like Deutsche Wohnen, like SV, or like whatever, and BlackRocks and like this. And I hope we had this situation in the same time, like 20 years ago, and we hope all the community has a possibility to say, this is our city, this is our street, and we fight for our people, and we fight for our streets, and for our class, and for our city, and for our flats, and for our houses. This is very important to fight now for the future, because I'm now here, but in 20 years maybe I'm not here, and then Berlin was in 100 years ago so different, 50 years ago so different. Now it's different, and it will be also very changed in 20 years and in 30 years.
Thank you, Hülya. There is a comment here also on Joanna's response. We are not all in the same boat. The working class is in a more precarious situation until and unless a campaign recognizes the class difference, it will remain to be an elitist movement. This is a commentary one person left us in the chat, in the streaming. Before we go to final statements, closing statements, first I wanted to say that now if people refresh their screens, they can see some links to the campaign Deutsche Wohnen und Enteignen, and also specifically to the working group Right to the City, and also to coming events of the working group International Working Group of Die Linke. And yeah, before we go to these closing statements, I would like to announce following events of the working group Left International. First of all, this Sunday at 13 hours, we as Left Internationals will meet in front of the Hindu temple on Hasenheide, close to the U1 Hermannplatz, to celebrate, if the weather allows it, the beginning of the spring. It's an informal meeting to meet up without agenda, so you're all of you invited to come. Second, on Wednesday, the 7th April, we have our next public meeting called COVID-19, a Socialist Response, with, among other speakers, the virologist Rob Wallace, that you can follow in our webpage here, theleftberlin.com, like today. And finally, next Wednesday, the 24th of March, it takes place the next meeting of the group Right to the City, the working group Right to the City in the campaign Deutsche Wohnen und Enteignen, where we, the migrant people, are organized among other places, but specifically this Right to the City. You are, of course, invited to all these events. And if you have any question, please send an email to our email address, lag.internationals@dielinke.berlin, or to our Facebook page, the Left Berlin International Working Group of Die Linke. And now, before we finish with this event, you want to say any closing statement? Let's start with Joanna.
Well, we've been talking for a long time, so I think just a short closing statement is make other signs, join, and let's keep Berlin. Let's make sure that these young people, like the Two-Man-Fold, that we do our best to make sure that they can enjoy the city too.
Thank you. Direct to the point. Directly. Hülya, do you want to say any closing statement?
Yeah, closing statement is to be a voice for the people, for the worker class, for all the women and kids, and for all the people who never been so in the agenda and in the political agendas. And yeah, to be a voice and to be a power for these people and fight for these people.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hülya. And I would like to thank all the people who have followed this event, this streaming. And this streaming, I must say, it has been possible thanks to the work behind the techniques of Hanna Hrelskiewicz. So thank you very much to you also. Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you, Hülya. We also have, before we had Karen, if you want to, if you came late or later and you didn't see the complete streaming, you can watch it again in the YouTube. And yeah, thank you very much. And I hope we will meet in the struggle. Have a nice day and have a nice week.
Thanks.